From a king who built an army of 8,000 soldiers to protect him in the afterlife, to a countess who bathed in the blood of young women to stay young, to the man who invented the light bulb secretly spending decades trying to build a phone that could call the dead, humans have always been absolutely terrified of dying, and they have always come up with the most insane possible solutions. None of them worked. Some of them made things significantly worse, and every single civilization across every single century has had its own version of the same desperate idea. This is the history of humans trying to cheat death and losing. Let's go back to the very beginning. Not ancient Rome, not ancient Egypt. Further, around 2100 BC in ancient Mesopotamia, a king named Gilgamesh watched his best friend die and completely fell apart. Gilgamesh was already legendary. Ancient texts describe him as 2/3 god and 1/3 human, which is the kind of math that only makes sense if you're trying to explain why someone is extraordinary. And he was. But watching someone he loved die broke something in him, and so he did what kings do. He decided the problem of death was simply a problem to be solved. He left his kingdom and walked to the ends of the known earth, looking for a man named Utnapishtim, who had supposedly been granted immortality by the gods. He crossed mountains. He crossed the waters of death. He found Utnapishtim. And Utnapishtim told him there was a plant at the bottom of the sea that could restore youth. Gilgamesh dove to the bottom of the sea and got it. He actually found it. And then on the way home, he stopped to rest beside a pool of water, left the plant on the ground, and a snake came along and ate it. The oldest recorded quest for immortality in human history ended because of a snake and a moment of inattention. The epic was written down roughly 4,000 years ago. Humans have been telling this story ever since because something about it feels deeply, painfully familiar. Now jump forward about 2,000 years to ancient China, where the first emperor of China, Qin Shi Huang, was running the most powerful empire in the known world and was absolutely not okay with the idea of dying. Qin Shi Huang unified China, standardized its currency, built the early foundations of the Great Wall, and by most historical measures was one of the most consequential rulers who ever lived. He was also convinced that death was optional if you found the right solution. He sent entire expeditions, thousands of people, sailing east to find islands where immortality elixirs supposedly grew. The expeditions never came back, possibly because the islands didn't exist. Possibly because the people he sent decided they preferred literally anywhere else to working for Qin Shi Huang. He consulted hundreds of alchemists. He became obsessed with Mercury, which ancient Chinese alchemists believed held mystical life-extending properties. He drank mercury compounds. He bathed in rivers of flowing mercury. His tomb, which contains the famous terracotta army of 8,000 warrior statues, also reportedly contained rivers of actual liquid mercury designed to mirror the rivers of China in the afterlife. And Qin Shi Huang died at 49, almost certainly from mercury poisoning, killed by the very substance he believed would make him immortal. The soldiers he built to protect him in death are still standing. He is not. But if drinking mercury sounds extreme, Elizabeth Báthory found a different approach. Báthory was a Hungarian countess born in 1560, one of the most powerful noblewomen in Europe, and she became convinced that the blood of young women had youth-preserving properties. The historical record is genuinely disputed. Some historians argue she was the victim of a political conspiracy, and the full extent of the accusations were exaggerated. But the documented record is still deeply disturbing. Beginning around 1590, young women began disappearing from the villages around her castle. The official count from her eventual trial put the number of victims at 80. One of her own accomplices reportedly claimed the number was over 600. Báthory was eventually arrested in 1610, but because of her noble status, she wasn't executed. She was walled into a set of rooms in her own castle with small slits for food and air, where she died 4 years later. She remains one of the most documented alleged serial killers in history. The idea that she was driven at least partly by a belief that blood could preserve her youth is referenced in the trial documents of the period. Whether the obsession with immortality created the crimes or the crimes were simply attributed to it afterward, the result was the same. Death came for her anyway, just later and in worse circumstances than if she'd simply lived normally. And while Báthory was pursuing her methods in Eastern Europe, Pope Innocent VIII in Rome was trying something that sounded, on paper, slightly more medical. In 1492, the same year Columbus sailed, Pope Innocent VIII was gravely ill and dying. His physician, according to accounts from the period, arranged for blood transfusions from 3 young boys who were paid 1 ducat each. The boys died. The Pope also died shortly after. The historical accuracy of whether this was a true blood transfusion in any modern medical sense is debated. Blood transfusions, as we understand them, weren't medically viable until the 20th century, but the accounts from the period describe something along those lines being attempted. Whether it happened exactly as described or was embellished by later writers, it reflects an idea that was already circulating in Renaissance Europe, that young blood contained something vital that old bodies had lost. That idea was not unique to 1492. It would resurface repeatedly across the next 5 centuries and still resurfaces in various forms today. Now let's talk about Isaac Newton. When most people picture Newton, they picture a man who sat under an apple tree and invented gravity. What they don't picture is a man who spent a significant portion of his life secretly trying to turn metal into gold and find the Philosopher's Stone, a mythical substance that alchemists believed could not only transmute base metals into gold, but also create an elixir of life that would grant immortality. Newton's alchemical manuscripts, which he kept largely hidden during his lifetime, run to over 1 million words. 1 million. He conducted thousands of experiments, many of them involving heating and inhaling mercury compounds and other toxic substances. He had what historians now believe was a nervous breakdown in 1693, possibly caused by chronic heavy metal poisoning. His hair samples, analyzed centuries after his death, showed extremely high levels of mercury and lead and antimony and arsenic. Newton didn't find the Philosopher's Stone. What he found was a body so contaminated by his own experiments that it's remarkable he lived to 84. He was arguably the greatest scientific mind in human history, and he spent years of that mind chasing something that didn't exist, breathing in substances that were slowly destroying him. The gravity stayed. The immortality did not. And then there's Ponce de León, the Spanish explorer who has become synonymous with the search for the fountain of youth, a spring of water that supposedly granted youth to anyone who drank or bathed in it. The historical record is complicated. Ponce de León himself never explicitly mentioned the fountain of youth in his own writings, and the association seems to have been attached to him by later writers. But he did explore Florida extensively in 1513, and he did die in 1521 from a wound he received during his second expedition there. The fountain of youth, as a concept, is far older than Ponce de León. Ancient Greek writers described similar springs, and the idea appears in texts from cultures across Africa, Asia, and Europe. The obsession with magical water that reverses aging is so universal and so persistent that it says something profound about how humans have always processed the fact of dying. Every civilization, given enough time, eventually invents a spring somewhere in an unreached territory that fixes everything. And someone always goes looking for it. Thomas Edison, by the time he was working on what he called a spirit phone in the early 1920s, was already the most famous inventor in American history. The phonograph, the light bulb, the motion picture camera, the man had reshaped the physical world. And yet, in the last decade of his life, he became convinced that consciousness survived death, and that with the right device, it might be possible to detect or even communicate with the dead. He spoke about it in interviews. He wrote about it in his diary. Whether he actually built a prototype or whether this was more of a theoretical obsession remains unclear. No working device was ever documented. But the fact that Edison, the man who more than almost anyone else embodied the idea that technology could solve any problem, turned his attention in his final years to the problem of death, says something. The thing about death is that it eventually gets everyone in the room, regardless of what they've already solved. And finally, Rasputin. Grigory Rasputin was a Russian mystic who inserted himself into the court of Tsar Nicholas II in the early 1900s by reportedly being able to ease the suffering of the Tsar's son, who had hemophilia. He became enormously influential and enormously hated by the Russian nobility. In December 1916, a group of conspirators invited him to a dinner party and attempted to assassinate him. According to the accounts, which have been significantly embellished over the decades and are now considered partly legendary, they fed him food laced with cyanide, which didn't kill him. They shot him, which didn't kill him immediately. He allegedly got up and tried to escape. They shot him again. They beat him. They threw him into the frozen Neva River. He died from drowning according to the autopsy. The actual historical account is less dramatic than the legend. Forensic re-examinations suggest the cyanide story was likely exaggerated, and some of the details were invented by the conspirators themselves to make the story more dramatic. But the legend of Rasputin as a man who simply would not die became so powerful that it took on a life of its own. He didn't achieve immortality, but the story of his death is so extraordinary that he got the next best thing. Nobody has forgotten him. Because here's what every single person on this list had in common. From Gilgamesh to Rasputin, from Qin Shi Huang to Isaac Newton. They were all staring at the same wall, and they all decided in their own way that the wall could be moved if you just tried hard enough, found the right substance, drank the right thing, built the right machine, bathed in the right river. None of them moved the wall, but the trying, the absolutely unhinged, desperate, sometimes murderous trying, is one of the most human things that has ever existed. And if you want to see what happens when modern humans try the same thing with billion-dollar budgets and Silicon Valley technology, that video is right here. And if you haven't subscribed to BearlyTold yet, this is the moment. Because we find the stories history forgot, and we make sure you never forget them. Hit that subscribe button. The bear is watching.